I'm here today with the incredible Erika T. Wurth. Erika is the author of White Horse and The Haunting of Room 904, and she's an urban native of Apache, Chickasaw, Cherokee descent. She's a New York Times editor's pick, a Good Morning America Buzz pick, and an Indie Next Target Book of the Month and Book of the Month pick. She's also a professor at Western Illinois University and a narrative artist for the Meow Wolf Denver installation. Welcome, Erika.
Thank you so much.
I know that was very brief. Can you fill in some of the blanks for us?
Yeah, and it's always kind of I'm always kind of trying to get the impressive bits in as like in a condensed manner as possible. But all that it does is create a tongue twister. So thank you for getting through it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, I guess a couple of things. I was a professor of creative. I am a professor of creative writing. I've been a professor of creative writing for 20 years. I did my doctorate in, technically it was a literature track, but I wanted to be in creative writing. So I did my dissertation in part creative. And, I was this very super nerdy kid, but I was kind of persuaded out of it. And so I wrote what people call literary fiction for a long time, but what I would call just realism. And I think, eventually for me, I kind of about 10, 15 years ago, I realized I really want to go back to my nerdy roots. And, I'm stopping my students from writing things that they want to write. And that's not cool. Just because, I have these ways in which I was trained. Oh, it's not as good to write in these genres, right? And so I started writing, I started experimenting with the sci-fi book and I kind of put it down. And then I started writing a book that, clearly the trajectory was horror. And I started reading horror again. And so, yeah, that's when I also learned, structure, I think better structure and story. I don't think I had a very good sense of that. I think academia is just not a good place to learn that. And so I started writing what it became White Horse, right? And, I did okay. It ended up with Flatiron / Macmillan, and I think it did pretty well. And, I got all these, lovely things on my little resume plate. So yeah.
Awesome. And when I ask people this question, I normally get one of two responses. Either I've been into horror for as long as I can remember, or I came to it later. So
Right.
when did horror find you?
I would say I probably like a sort of super nerdy kid. I used to eat lunch under the display case because I'm like, they can't find me here to get me. Um, and so anything that was supernatural, I was really into.
Mm.
I did like a little bit of crime. I liked a little bit of Nancy Drew, but I was, a reader since I can remember, right? My dad read to me, my mom read to me. My dad read me Lewis L'Amour and the Martian Chronicles, right? So you can kind of see my trajectory from there. And I want to say it was fantasy I might have come to first, but I think, in the 80s and 90s, Stephen King was like really king. And so
Mm.
everyone was reading that. And people always talk about like where I went to school, like I was middle class. But long story short, my parents were working class and I went to school in the working class area and people were like, oh, people don't read in those areas. They did. They read Stephen King and they read all these authors that were, his peers at the time. So that's probably 12, 13 years old. Maybe earlier I was reading like paranormal ghost girl books, which are, in some ways what I write now. And then I started reading King and then I was reading science fiction. And then, I stopped for a long time because I thought, oh, no, that's not real literature. And I'm a serious person. I want to write serious things. So, in some ways 12 and in some ways 40,
All right. Yeah, I feel like the whole label of genre fiction is starting to lift, and people are realizing horror can be a lot more than just something at the back of the bookstore that we don't talk about.
Right. That reminds me of when I worked for like a video store and we had a
Mhm.
porn section in the back and like that, that's what yeah.
But thank goodness that's changing.
Yes. Yes.
And I do want to ask about your writing process. I know you probably get this a lot, but how do you get started? Do you have any writing rituals, like a candle you need or a beverage you need? And what does that look like for you?
I would say I've needed coffee as a beverage since I can remember. Like native kids drink coffee really, really, really early. So this has been my beverage of choice since I can remember. But my process overall, yes, it's I get up in the morning and I have that time where I try to squeeze in that time to write between other things, right? If I'm teaching, there's that, oftentimes I'll get a request for something else. But I think in terms of process, what matters to me the most in terms of what to talk about is people always, especially Americans, they like to think of themselves as all iconoclasts, and that's nice. And we kind of are. Like, I'll give us that. And so we'll say things like, well, there should be no rules. And that's nice. That's a nice sentiment, but it's also, in a way, kind of elitist because if you tell someone you just have to have that talent, and if you're not going somewhere productive, that's on you. I just think that's really kind of it's maddening, and it was for me. And so, regardless of whether someone's coming from a literary academic background or like they're like, well, I'm self trained and I like to write fantasy, or I'm I self publish or whatever the perspective. When I started to learn that story and structure, which I really valued, had to be learned from books that a lot of people poo poo, like Save the Cat Writes a Novel, or Chuck Wendig's Damn Fine Story. I think it has the best description of a catalyst ever. Or, gosh, I love Mastering Suspense, Structure, and Plot by Jane Cleland. They told me where anybody would put the things, and I think for me, it's an uninteresting question to say, oh, if you decide on any beats in a novel, then it's paint by numbers. That's so silly. That's like something my introduction of creative writing students would say. And they're lovely folks, but they're almost children. They're 18, 19, 20 years old, right? So if you're saying the same thing as somebody who's like in that position, I think there's something wrong. And I think that what I always say is there are a million ways to write a catalyst. And your job is to find the most catalyst, the most unique catalyst that's your expression ever, not to be like, why should we have a catalyst? Because it's good. That's why. It's like a chocolate chip cookie. It's good. Most cookies are good. That's why. You can tell I'm kind of a sugar hall.
I think that's such a great answer. I mean, I have Save the Cat Writes a Novel on my bookshelf. I went through all of those books in the beginning, and they're super helpful. I mean, I don't, look at them every single time I'm writing a book now, but I'm so glad I read them and I understood and why did these things work and how can I play off of those? It's really important.
God, yes. God, yes. I think in academia, especially, I think they think that they're, iconoclastic, but what it is poetry was the first form to be considered art. And poetry is extremely dependent on language, right? And also, like, if something's full of big Latin based words, you can say, look at how this is clearly art, right? This is because it's hard to understand on the surface. And so, they value what aligns themselves with the thing that became art first. And I get it. But I think the more important part is like, I mean, gosh, Cloud Atlas, talk about like a book that absolutely has a catalyst and a call to arms, but it is incredibly sophisticated in terms of story and structure. So, yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, when you are starting your story, what comes first? Do you have the characters, the plot, the title, the setting? What comes first that pops into your brain that says, I have to be a book?
Yeah. I think the first thing that pops is for whatever reason, that moment, right? Where you're like, this idea plus these people, boom, just sort of says, this needs to be a novel, right? And who knows why? I can talk, if we talk about what I'm working on now, I'll talk about that at the end. And I had a really, probably the strongest moment in that regard in my life with this one. But I think that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, I do go to Save the Cat. The part of it is, I think if you've written like 10 novels and the beats, like Chuck Wendig and I've talked about this, he's like, well, I stopped needing to go. I'm still probably there in some ways. And on top of it, I kind of do like to layer a more complicated structure. So I want to make sure I have like I'm following any kind of realistic trajectory. So I do go to that. I do a basic beat sheet, and then I do a chapter by chapter, just one or two sentences about what I think might be in this chapter. Does that change radically? Yes. Have I now moved that to I'm going to write the first half of that, and then once I get to it, then I'll write the second half? Yes, because I'm at the point now where I have to accept like the second half is going to be so radically changed. But I do have the basic beats down. So yeah, that's my process. And I used to write books of poetry, so it's not like I don't care about language. Of course, I care about language, but I care about story and structure because it's actually really hard to execute. And if you haven't noticed, I have the most ADD, circulatory reasoning mind in the world. So if you tell me like, oh, just write the novel, then no one wants that. Nobody wants that. Not even my dogs, so.
Yeah, I think the hardest thing for me is pacing because I mean, I don't outline. I have in the past. I'm not doing it right now, but I have found sometimes you just write yourself into a corner and you're like, this is really slow. What's happening? Where do I go from here? And the worst thing is feeling like you have to throw away a bunch of work. That's just the worst.
Which you're going to anyway, but I think you can throw away maybe a little less, you know what I
Yeah.
mean, by plotting it out before. But pacing's tough. And I think what I learned from the crime novelist, right, is that you want to make sure every chapter has like kind of a mission. And then
Mhm.
once that mission is accomplished, you finish the chapter. Now, the book that I'm writing now is much more SFF leaning. So I have one chapter that's in an alternative reality that's 20 pages long. And I'm like, oh, I don't know. I don't know. Like it's making me nervous, but we'll see. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I would love to talk more about The Haunting of Room 904, which is your most recent release. Can you give
Yeah.
just a little introduction to that book and what inspired you?
Yeah. So I try to do the quicker log line, which is um, a woman is called to solve a crime in a haunted hotel where her sister died. And if she doesn't solve it right, her mother dies, right? So that's the simplest log line. But it's probably even more layered than White Horse, right? With these sort of like sometimes like alternative timelines and stuff like that. And so I try to give people, hey, here are these progressive, quick, interesting beats. And then here are these moments like nonfiction elements or something that's sort of stuck outside of time or talks about a different point in time. And I make those short, right? And I try to make them pretty enough that they're worthwhile. But yeah, so the longer log line, right, is there's a woman, she um, was getting her PhD in psychology, and her sister calls her up, and her sister and her mom always claim to be a psychic and see things, and the main character is like, Olivia, I don't feel that. I think they're just entertaining themselves. And she's like, if you don't come to room 904 in the Brown Palace, right, I'm going to die. And she's like, I'm drunk, I'm graduating, just join me, calm down. So when she goes to sleep that night, she wakes up to her sister's ghost. And she realizes later, or she feels anyway, it's been reported that her sister suicided in that room. And she has her sort of powers turn on and she sees ghosts and like her academic career is ruined. So she and her best friend decide to create a paranormal detective business. But then the Brown Palace calls her and says, you know what? Every 5 years, because of this ghost that lives in 904, we guess a woman is wherever she is in the hotel, she reappears in 904, commits suicide, and we can't stop it. And now your sister is appearing in this room. And so you're going to want to solve this crime. And she's like, absolutely not. Until her mother checks in and she knows she's got 3 weeks and to solve the crime until her mother dies. So that's the longer one.
Well, I loved it. Just gonna get that out there
Thank you.
now. And one
Thanks.
thing that I was really interested in the story is there are so many traditions and religions and cultures represented in it, from indigenous to Jewish. So, what was your research process like to capture all of these cultures on the page?
The baseline was where I grew up. So I grew up in between two towns right outside of Denver. There's Denver, Evergreen, which has become very gentrified, and even Idaho Springs now, where I went to school, very gentrified. So I was bused to school in Idaho Springs, and I kind of lived in country. So where I grew up, there were Nez or Navajo people, Lakota people, Oklahoma mixes, many Mexican folks who are generally speaking of some indigenous heritage, and lots of working class white folks, some middle class folks. And they were evangelicals and they were Native American church, and different languages were spoken. And then yeah, I not only did I grow up with some Jewish folks, but also my partner, his kids, their mother is Jewish. So obviously, like it's kind of on my mind. Additionally, I find like obviously they're incredibly different with incredibly different trajectories, but there are some interesting similarities between some indigenous thinking and some Jewish thinking, and they both have really interesting mythologies. And so yeah, and they have great boogeymen. And so like I kind of wanted to put that together. And so then what I did was I went far into like indigenous like beliefs, right? Because I was kind of raised vaguely Native American church, with a Catholic background and Christian background and all that stuff way back in the day. But there are certain Mexican Indian traditions that run really, really deep, and that's some part of my mom's family's background. And so I wanted to explore that a little bit more. And then obviously I did more research, like the golem, right, and that's inside the Jubik box. And so I just find that completely interesting. The whole idea, anything, any kind of locked supernatural box, I'm like, what's in there? Must know. So yeah.
That was also one of the creepiest scenes, for sure.
Yeah. I was trying to figure that out. I'm like, is it creepy when the little doll Gollum comes to life, or is it just incredibly stupid?
I thought it was creepy. I definitely thought it was creepy. Did you
Yeah.
creep yourself out writing this book at all?
Oh yeah, there were times. I actually listen a lot to David Lynch's soundtrack to is it Twin Peaks? Yeah, the Twin Peaks the movie, because it's such a
Mm.
scary soundtrack. That's how I like spook myself out. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Are there words in it? Because when I'm writing, I cannot listen to anything with words in it.
Yeah, I try not to listen to anything with words, but for some reason, if I've listened to it a lot or if it has kind of like repetitive words that don't like pull my interest in, like I can listen while to that while I write. But yeah, it's The Black Dog Comes at Night. That's the song that's in the soundtrack, which is the scariest. And for some reason, that phrase, since that's basically all that's said, it scares me and at the same time does not distract me. So perfect.
Huh. Very cool. I'm gonna have to try that.
Yeah.
Well, as you mentioned, this book is super layered. There's a lot going on. What do you hope that readers take away from it?
Yeah, people have asked that question, and I realize what a good question it is. And I'm not sure if I ever adequately answer it, which is, number one, I think, Indigenous issues really matter. And that's great. I think that's important. I'm obviously addressing a number. I do it very, very differently than I think a lot of Native writers for a variety of reasons. I don't need people to come, and nor do I really want people to come away from anything that I write, and I kind of ideally wouldn't want that from anything anyone writes with like, I understand Indigenous culture now. Because if I wanted that, I would have a different PhD and I would have a different career. Like I'd be an anthropologist. And I think that's meaningful and interesting, right? But I do think it's cool when people come away with like, wow, I didn't understand in the sort of intersection of Southeast Native American and Mexican Native American that happens in Texas. There is this unique juncture of culture that spreads everywhere, and that there are all kinds of different ways to think of supernatural things, right? And different worldviews to have. I also hope like people come away with it with a better, like with a sense of fun. Like, wow, that was like, I tore through that and it was fun to read, right? Because I think natives and people reading natives, that should be allowed, right? I remember I read a really funny satirical piece years ago where I'm a professor, and people laughed, and this one professor was like, "I cannot believe they laughed at you," and I'm like, I don't, I'm hypersensitive to this, being a nerdy kid, but I promise, I think they were laughing with me, right? Like we're allowed to laugh. But the other thing I thought about was one of the things I've thought about too after writing this book is that the character's sister did struggle with depression. And that, yes, this exists, especially on reservations, but with Native communities in general. And there's a lot of arguments as to why, right? Tons of arguments as to where it comes from. So without getting too far into that, because a lot of that's in the book, one of the things I've learned is that it really is like whether it's struggling with your weight, struggling with depression, alcoholism, it is epigenetics. And you kind of can't help those things. It doesn't mean that there isn't a solve for them. In fact, they're more and more innovative about these solves as the years go by. But it really strikes me that like it's important to see depression in the way that we see, or alcoholism in the way that we see heart disease. So
Mhm. Yeah, so a lot of messages to take away. This is a very
yeah,
complex book, which is awesome.
yeah, I can't help that.
And we don't want you to. We don't want you to.
Yeah.
Well, kind of in a broader sense, how would you categorize your type of horror?
That is such, it's funny you say that, because what I was thinking about is, like, for example, I absolutely adore Mallerman's Incidents Around the House, right? It is simple. It is an IKEA furniture apartment, and it is about kind of like one deep thing and one superficial thing. It is
Mhm.
about this entity that is haunting this family, but underneath it all, it's about when infidelity hits a family, how does it impact the whole family? So he builds these beautifully frightening, like I think the first chapter is six words. And like I so admire the economy. And I mean that. That is 100% not a backhanded compliment. But I cannot help it. Like I build mansions. So,
Mhm.
you know what I mean? Like I cannot help that. So that's kind of what I think a lot about. I'm so sorry. I have Professor Head. Your original question was
How would you categorize your type of horror?
yes. And so it's sort of like mansion horror, like I'm
Ooh.
not quite a paranormal romance lady, right? And I love those ladies. I think they totally don't get their due in the horror world, but I'm certainly not splatterpunk. And
Mhm.
I'm definitely not writing this like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know how to do an economic book. And in fact, if anything, it's just getting worse, really. Um, but I think that like maybe paranormal
Mhm.
fiction, some people categorize it as thriller because I borrowed that crime structure. So yeah, that's a
Mhm.
really hard and good question, right?
Mhm. I mean, I struggle with that too. I think my own work goes all across the different subgenres. So it's
Right.
definitely a hard question to answer, and you don't even have to because you wanna leave lots of freedom for you to write whatever you want, like science fiction.
Yeah, well, but I love that question though because the scholar in me is like, let's categorize, So so I get it. So I guess that's paranormal thriller. There we go.
I like that. And I've got another scholarly question for you. Why do you
Sure.
think horror matters, and why are people drawn to scary books and scary media?
Yeah, I think it's fun. I think that I've thought about it a lot because there've been so many good horror movies. In fact, I went and saw Hokum, which I is
Mhm.
right up my alley. It's about a writer and it's about a ghost and it's a mystery. So I have to say I really adored that. But I can see why people obsession's just a masterpiece. Like I totally get
Mhm.
it. I've been thinking about this a lot. Like, why do people like horror? What are they drawn to? What does it matter? What does it do for us? I do think, in some ways, very simplistically and mechanistically, what it does is we used to be chased by things, and we used to die a lot before vaccines, and so it scratches that itch, right? Like we cannot help it. We need that thrill. I think my friend Cynthia Playo has said, and so have other horror writers, that it helps you process your trauma to like go through it and come back, come out the other side, safely. And I
Mhm.
think that's probably a lot of it too. For me, it does kind of help me sleep because obviously I have a really super overactive brain. Um, and so if I scare myself enough, it distracts me. So it's always helped me sleep. Yeah.
I
So
like
I
that.
don't
I don't know how
recommend
many people would say that.
right, right. I realized that at one point, like I had to ask myself honestly, like, what does it really, really do for me? And it's like, it's a sleep drug. So sorry, my
Hmm,
dog is stretching in the background. Yeah, she's like, "Hello,
it's
I
okay.
work."
I've got one over there too.
Oh, it's like in Snoopy position. Oh,
His name is
yeah.
Tater Tot.
Hi, Tater. I love that. This one's Addie. Hi, Addie. Hi.
Hi.
And the one over here is Ava. Yes.
Oh, hi
Hi.
puppies.
Yep, they're just little fluffy dogs.
Well, I'm gonna ask you one more kind of scholarly question. What do you wish we saw more of in the horror world?
I think that no, my answer wants to be I'd like to see those paranormal romance women writers get more attention.
Hmm,
Um, I think that what's happening when it comes to women writing horror is very confusing. And these are the kinds of conversations in academia, I'll give it this, that we've had that are complicated. So kind of reminds me of like people have been like, well, pink horror, I don't want to
mhm,
be shot into that category. And that's a legitimate response. I felt that as a woman, I felt that as an Indigenous person. It is true that one of the most disappointing reactions for my book or any other Indigenous book is like, I just love Indians. I'm like, that's nice and creepy, So I don't love that. But I think that what has to happen and what I'd like to see more of is less of a hard categorization of what is woman, right?
mhm,
And what is appropriately feminist in that regard. So, for example, a lot of people are like, well, pink horror is just male horror dressed in a pink jumpsuit. And that is, yeah, like I can see the objection there, right? In other words, um, you're, or some people feel like, like if you're just doing like okay, this is a popular male horror book, I'm doing the pink version of it. I get that
Mhm.
objection. Or if you're like, well, the only kind of appropriate fiction for women to write and women to read is romance flavored horror, or is horror that's really, very, very superficial and has to address, female issues, right? But at the
Mhm.
same time, it kind of reminds me of being in academia, and I would wear like a dress and heels, and I just felt very powerful in those things. Like, and it isn't like I'm powerful being submissive, actually, because that is the opposite of me if you know me in any way. I mean, quite literally, I was taller, I looked cool, and I'm a strong person. And all of these women in academia would be like, I just can't believe you wear that. And I'd be like, really? Because I'm the only one of you who doesn't have a children, do not have children. I am not married. Now I am partnered, right? That did come to me later in life. Um, I'm the only one of you in a department meeting who will tell men, yeah, I'm not going to do that. I'm the only one. And so, like, you really, if you want to boil your feminism down to a pair of footwear, you know what I mean, then that seems ridiculous. To me, what I want to see more of is women's horror and indigenous horror of all kinds, right? Like, and not being boiled down to like, I object to being just a woman writer. It should be simply
Mhm.
like, these are the things that affect women. I'm trying to address them as intelligently and uniquely and in the way that only I can address them as possible. That to me is more of what matters and more of what I'd like to see. And I know my pink horror panel, the politics of pink horror at Stoker, is definitely going to be like the man hating panel, which I don't, like I don't object to, but I'm really not intending, I suppose, to do, which is why do even women horror readers go so damn hard for men writing women, and they just don't go as hard for women writing women. Although,
Mhm.
again, in the paranormal romance community, that's the opposite. And then the horror community says, well, that's not real horror. So I think that's part of the bigger thing that I want to see change, in the horror community over time.
Interesting. There are a lot of big questions there. I've heard the debate over the pink horror thing. Some people really embrace it. Some people say, "Don't put me in that bucket." And yeah, it's a thorny issue.
Yes, really is. And like, for example, I just read Trad Wife by Saratoga Schaefer.
I'm reading
And
that right
then
now.
God. And then I asked, like, I never asked a blurb because blurbs, look, all right, that's a lie. I always asked a blurb because, like, they're just people I really like and I want to help, right? So
Mhm.
I read Trad Wife by Saratoga Schaefer, and then there's another one coming out, and then I'm blurbing the next. And I can understand why Saratoga is like, please don't put me in your women's,
Mhm.
list because I'm a they. Now there,
Mhm.
I'm like, no, they're not pink horror. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So I that, but beyond that, like I don't fucking care. Like I am indigenous and I am a woman. So yeah, put me on your fucking list. But yes, it would be nice to be on the other list too. So
Mhm. Yeah. Well, now it's time for the hardest question I'm going to ask you, or maybe not. What is your favorite horror book and why?
a great question. Yeah, you know what? I'm going to say something like everyone tries to be so idiosyncratic and unique. And I'm like, no, it's Mexican Gothic. Oh my God. I really am. I love that fucking book. Sylvia's smart. She has the mind of a scholar. The only one I think and he's written so many books in this regard, and I admire him in the same way as Grady Hendrix. He's the only one that I know that probably has the same encyclopedic knowledge of horror fiction and film.
Mhm.
And with Moreno Garcia, add Mexican film, add Mexican novels, add Latin American novels. And so I just admire her as a thinker. But also, Mexican Gothic to me is like perfect because it's fun to read,
Mhm.
it's supernatural, it's weird. The bad guy's a mushroom.
Mhm.
That's so weird. And I love that. And then it hits really hard hitting issues like
Mhm.
you have, and she does something that a lot of, I think, Canadian and American Indian writers are afraid to do, which is she makes her character, who's an indigenous character, it's just organically part of who she is. In fact, it's
Mhm.
part of how she's able to defeat the bad guy because her ancestors used mushrooms traditionally. So she knows how, just on a genetic level, to defeat the bad guy. But she's also mean and she smokes and she's like upper class. And I love that. Natives always have to play this game of like, oh, how can I be most representative? And she's like, no, I'm not going to do that. And so it's just such a fun book. Like I know some people said like the ending isn't it for them, but nah, I still liked it. I just like the
I
book.
picked it for my book club, and we all ate stuffed mushrooms while we talked about it. It was fantastic.
I love that. I want to do that. That's great.
It was fun. It was very fun. Well,
Yes.
you've kind of hinted at this already, but what is next on the horizon for you? What are you working on?
Yeah, I so basically, like I said, I was a nerdy kid. I realized in writing this book, I'll never entirely leave the whole paranormal horror thing behind. It's just too much fun for me. So basically, the origin story is I was talking to a friend and I said, I have this ancestor and they were born in District 11. And this woman who's a genealogist and she's a member of the North Carolina Cherokee Nation, was like, "Ooh, wow, Erica, you know what that is?" She's like, "First of all, that particular area was unbelievably empty. There were only a handful of Indians in that area at the time." So she said, "The thing about that area is why it was named that was right when the Cherokees were essentially forced to give over that territory. And before it was given an American name, it was labeled District 11." And my friend said, "God, that's so Nazi esque." And I don't know why, but that made my mind explode. I was like, what if there were an alternative timeline where genocide had never occurred? And so this character, it started with this woman who she's walking with her auntie as a kid. She saw what Apache call Ga'an, or a little person, and it just disappears and it changes their lives. Auntie ends up in Appalachia trying to find supernatural things. She disappears. Main character, Daheste, she decides to get a degree in anthropology and do research on this. She ends up in Appalachia. She's going to, she's like, all right, I'll at least get a ghost on film or a little person on film. I'll get something on film. And instead, she has this entity called the Old Woman, and the Old Woman's origins, like it's Appalachian, but it's originally Cherokee. And this entity is called Atlanta. And so she's haunting her and she's like hunting her. And so this woman she's interviewing says, she'll do that for life until you're insane. You have to go to this cabin in the woods. You have to do this particular ceremony. You do that, she might leave you alone. So she does it. She finds it, even though you often can't find the cabin, right? And the old woman appears, pushes her through a mirror, and she ends up in this alternative reality where genocide never occurred. And so basically, all these native people have what ostensibly are de facto magical powers because they are so scientifically advanced in this world, that their powers are essentially magical. They have like an organic ability with the world, right? That they can manipulate it into magical powers. So the Americans, though, this AI computer appeared out of time and said, you've never really been able to control these people or genocide them. Here's how. And so basically, they're making every advance that these native people make in this world brings them closer to their own genocide on every level. So the main character is sort of tasked with helping them like stop this. So I'm hoping it's a series. That's what I'm hoping. And I recently signed with a new agent at Trident, and he's just a powerhouse, and he's smart. And so I'm working on it now. I'm a little bit over halfway done, but a lot of horror books, not everyone, right? But I've kind of seen them as like these really tightly packed 300-page power horses. This is much more SFF, so it's a bigger baby. So it's taking longer to just gestate. So I think that's the right word. Yes.
No, I agree with you. Yeah, that sounds amazing and so different from anything I've even heard of.
Yeah, I'm so excited about it. Like my brain's never had, like I said, that moment of like, this is the new book, So
any idea when we might be able to read this?
No, because I hope to be done with it in the net by the end of the summer. I'm hoping Mark can sell it. I'm hoping it's a series, although I've heard, from Moreno Garcia, for example, and everyone else that even R.F. Kuang talks about this, another author I just adore, and that it's hard to sell series, but I'm hoping they can. I asked Tor about it, about a year ago, because I've thought about working with them, and they said we have a kind of technique and tactic for it. So I would talk to them. I'm gonna see who. I'd love to work with Del Rey. We'll see. Like I don't know. Maybe I won't be able to sell it at all, even as a singular, right? So we'll see what happens.
Well, I will be on the lookout for it. Does it have a title?
Right now it's Ghostland, but I think that sucks. And that's what I was going to say. You asked me about my process in terms of titles. I'm fucking terrible at that. Terrible. Like I'm just like, this story is called Story. So I have to like really hard. So hopefully someone else comes up with a good title because I'm not good. Yeah.
Titles are hard. I've some of them, the title comes before anything else, and then other times I just sit down and just kind of like word vomit anything that's kind of vaguely associated until I get to a point that feels good.
Oh, I love that. Maybe that's the way. Because, like, my former hangover as a poet is to find the most resonant line and use that. And it did
Mhm.
work in a story like I'm doing an anthology. Nick Cutter had associated for me an anthology, and I was like, ooh, she know what she'd heard. She know what she knew what she'd heard. She knew what she'd seen. That's the
Mhm.
first title where I was like, yeah, I think I nailed it, right? So, but otherwise, no, yeah, that's a good way to do it. I like that.
It's I've read that
Yeah.
in a book somewhere, and it has been so helpful.
Thank you. I'm going to do that. Yeah.
Well, any advice for other writers who want to have a career like yours?
Several parts to this. It doesn't matter whether you get an MFA or you're self-taught. MFAs can put you in contact with agents, professors who can maybe help you along. Peers, right? They tend to be very literary leaning, so that either means like kind of like postmodernish to the book club book. That's not always the case. There are some, usually low residency MFAs that deal with that. But no matter what, you want to study craft and you want to be pragmatic and try to put that ego aside, right? Read
Mhm.
Save the Cat Writes a Novel. Read all the fancy craft books that talk about language and recognize like what the important questions are. Again, like why do we have to have catalyst is not important question. What kind of catalyst would I write is an important question. And so I think again, Mastering Suspense, Structure, and Plot by Jane Cleland, I think is fantastic. And then I think, being patient, caring about your peers, understanding that, like, telling Stephen King he's awesome 50 times on whatever social media platform you're on is not going to get you anywhere. But, trying to find a peer group, who might read your work, following the writers who've been published in the last 5 years who are writing books that you're like, my book could be like that. Saying, hey, I really liked your book, putting that on Instagram with a fancy cup of coffee and a
Mhm.
succulus, the succulent. So you can tell I'm a horror writer because I'm a succulus. So anyway, and a whatever. Supporting other writers, taking that time, rewriting the book. And then one thing I always recommend, because it just happened to work this way for me, is I realized, and part of it is I have a PhD, so I had a skill set, but I started writing articles for like BuzzFeed and LitHub that were like, hey, 10 Native American books for you to read. And when I did that, I realized a lot of these editors were following me. And that helps because it's harder if you're a woman writing horror and it's not paranormal horror and if you're an indigenous writer, especially back when I was trying to get published, and people kind of want to push you down or they only want one Indian writer, right? They only
Mhm.
want one kind, whoever gives the illusion of most authentic Indian in the world. If you're trying to get an agent and these agents are just not signing you, getting attention in that way is good because then these people whose editors are editing the books that you're talking about are going to be interested in you. And so that's kind of how I went into this ass backwards. So yeah,
Very cool and very good advice that I have not heard before. Thank you.
yeah, of course.
Well, thank you so much. Can you tell everybody where they can find you and keep up with you and your work?
I am mainly on Instagram. I'm on Instagram, and then I say stupid things on Threads. I do that. So if you want to participate in that, please do. TikTok. I do try to make the flashy TikToks. Every once in a while. Even though I need to make unflashy TikToks. I guess I don't even know. So I'm there. Instagram mainly, TikTok, um, and certainly Threads.
Awesome. Well, thank you again.